Well, had a little bit of housekeeping to do there and a few buttons to click. Um, One of which because uh, based on where we are in going through the Bible, I decided I would like to start recording these and with the potential of making them available on a separate YouTube channel on my account. I'll have to learn how to set that up, how to get an additional channel on the same account. I'm pretty sure that people do that on a regular basis. I just haven't gotten into YouTube to figure out how to do it. Excuse me. So that's a possibility. Big news this week, at least around here, has been the weather. We had a pretty heavy rainstorm blow through on Monday, and sometime during the night, I got on to one of these weather streaming channels, and this is somebody that is based in Florida, and he was covering um, the weather that was blowing through. By the time he got there, it had mostly blown past us and was in Mississippi, Alabama, and the northwest corner of Florida, the panhandle up there, Pensacola, and that kind of area. It was interesting because he ran across a name I'd never heard of before, and he was trying to figure out how to pronounce it. It's a terrible time pronouncing names. But he came across Vinegar Bend, Alabama. Now, nowadays, Vinegar Bend, Alabama is a collection of 5 to 10 buildings on a rural road. And I got to thinking, a name like that, there has to be a story behind it. So I did a search, and sure enough, the name of that little community, I guess at one time it had like a population of 2,000. It still has a post office listed there, although I don't see a building necessarily where the post office is identified. But at any rate, apparently one time there was a post office there. The town got its name because at one time there was a railroad accident there, and the train spilled its cargo of vinegar. Furthermore, the town was home to someone who became a fairly well-known baseball player, and so the name of the town became fairly well known around the country after Vinegar Ben Mizell. I don't know what team he played for or what position he played, but at one time apparently that was fairly well known, and so the name of the little town got to be well known around the country. So that was a kind of an interesting side trip that I got off on while listening to that. And there were tornado warnings being issued, and a lot of pretty serious weather. Well, sometime less than 24 hours ago, I got on the same channel. He was live streaming again. Only this time the weather was a little closer to home. In fact, we had a pretty noticeable storm blow over where we live, probably about 24 hours ago now. And it continued its way eastward through the state. And sometime during the night, they got word that a law enforcement officer had confirmed a tornado on the ground in our state. Now, most of the warnings that were issued and the threats that they were paying attention to were out in largely agricultural districts where not a lot of buildings would be threatened by a tornado coming down, and and the one that was confirmed was apparently out in the middle of nowhere, so there hadn't been a whole lot of news about it. But and of course, the other weather situation facing people is that it's getting bitterly cold and heavy snowfall is falling in parts of the country. I think I saw recently that Iowa is getting it. Iowa is largely flat, not much to stop the winds, and they do tend to attract pretty substantial levels of snow. I recall once riding with my mother and my two sisters. We were taking them from Michigan back to school out in Utah. So this was in early January. Well, no, because I took them back on my own. The weather wasn't that bad on that trip. It might have been when my mother and I were going out to get them earlier, in which case my sisters weren't with us. At any rate, we were going through Nebraska, and we got off the interstate and pulled up at a gas station, and the ice on the windows of the gas station was so heavy we couldn't tell if the place was open or not. They were open. We did buy gas while we were there, and while I was in there, I happened to hear the manager of the station on the phone with a station a little bit farther down the highway that had better assets. And the issue was that there was a truck there, that a semi truck, an 18-wheeler rig, crossing, driving cross country, and he had a fuel leak. And this guy didn't have what it would take to patch the fuel leak and fix the guy's tank so he could go on. But he said, I'm thinking of sending him to you because you do have that stuff. And besides, in this weather, what's likely to happen with a little fuel dropping off onto the roadway? It's not very likely to cause a fire in this weather, and it was. It was very cold and windy and snowy and all that stuff. Yeah, Mia, you're here. You're my, well, you used to be my favorite kitty, but you've got too much tortitude for that. You pull all your fur out, so now the other kitty's prettier than you are. Meow, meow. So, something that happened week before last that we didn't mention last week, but that we were aware of, and that was the attack on a judge in Las Vegas, Nevada. There was a gentleman in the court being sentenced, and he didn't like the sentence as the judge began to pronounce it, and he screamed some insults and dirty words and went running toward the judge, took a flying leap, and landed essentially on her and began beating on her. Her clerk, a male clerk, immediately dove over, helped pull the guy off of her. Apparently at the time there had been several bailiffs in the room, but they had just escorted a group of prisoners out of the courtroom. This guy apparently was not in custody at the time, and so there was one bailiff left in there. He got up there, some other men got up there, and they got the guy pulled off the judge, and eventually the judge got up. She was apparently injured, but not seriously so. One of the bailiffs, because other bailiffs came running, there was an alarm that went off, and other bailiffs came running, and one of the bailiffs did receive a head injury that, well, like any scalp injury, it bled pretty bad, and was adjudged to be a relatively serious injury. So now the guy is yes, Mia, you're in my way. Stack of charges to the charges he already faced. And just, I think it was earlier this week, he was brought back to court in shackles and with a spit hood on, because apparently he spit on the judge during the attack, and with heavy mitts unfingered mitts over his hands, and the judge made a very specific point to say that the sentence I am imposing is the exact sentence that I was about to impose, and it is in my court calendar so anybody can see that the sentence I impose today is exactly the sentence that I was about to impose when the incident took place. She will not be the judge to hear the case of his attack on her for obvious reasons. One of which simply that she will be a material witness in the case. So, so um, my wife is asleep. If she wakes up, she'll probably call in and join us. In fact, why don't I find the right charging cord here and get my phone plugged in. So yeah, there it goes. It's now charging slowly. When you plug it into one of those wall outlets, it charges rapidly. When you plug it into a computer outlet, it charges, but the voltage isn't as high, so it doesn't charge as fast. You know, USB is set at 5 volts, but of course, voltages vary, and 5 volts. Anything that's designed to operate 5 volts can probably operate at anything from 3.5 to 7 or more volts. They have circuitry in there to make it work like that. Your car is 12 volts. Well, all the stuff in a car needs to be able to work at 8.5 to 14 or 15 volts. And in fact, the system, in order to charge it, will operate, depending on how much charging it needs to do, at 13 or 14 volts. So that the battery will rest, ideally, at its nominal 12 volt value. So anyway, I think it's time for us to go ahead and get started. I will not be minimizing the camera window for a little bit because I want to talk a little bit about the book we're starting before we do so. So let's bow our heads. Our Father in heaven, we thank you for your blessings. We thank you for the promise of the Spirit. We thank you for the gift of your Son, which has made the gift of the Spirit possible. We are learning to understand the nature of your character and your love and benevolence toward the human race. And we want to be transformed into that image. We understand that that's how we were designed to live, and we want to learn to live that way. We want the work of the Holy Spirit to take place in our lives, that transformation into that image might begin to take place. And we're studying the Word because we believe that there we can find the living Word, your Son, and we want the Holy Spirit to be a part of this process, to give to each person who hears the blessing and understanding that they need at this time. We ask in Jesus' name. Amen. Of all the books in the Bible, this book that we're about to begin, the book of Genesis, is the most controversial, shall we say. The interpretation of the book is controversial among Christians. The value of the book is it's the most highly controverted book amongst Bible critics. And there's a fairly simple and straightforward reason for that. Knowledgeable thinking Bible critics mostly rely on some of the inconsistencies in the book, which you can expect. If you've got a book written by as many different authors as the Bible is, and it probably has more authors even than are attributed as authors in the book. Uh, the Jews believe that some of the major prophets are actually the collections of writings of a number of different prophets who were put together into one book under one prophet's name. Um, Other books that are attributed to certain people certainly had multiple authors, Book of Psalms being an example of that. So you have a lot of different authors over some roughly 1,500 years, best we can tell, writing the various parts of this book. Um, yeah, that would tend to lead to a few inconsistencies in the writing. So that, we shouldn't be surprised by that. The only people who have a problem with that are the control addicted people who want to be able to force you to adhere to their interpretation of the Bible. So they want to hold that the Bible is absolutely infallible and every word is binding on you, and it's just a control thing. The Bible can be God's word without being absolutely flawless, and indeed, in this group we hold that there are some flaws, particularly in the Old Testament picture of God, but even to some extent in the New Testament. The Bible was written by human beings, and human beings have been in the process of getting to know God all along. And we have reason to believe that when Jesus came to this earth, although there was a religion supposedly focused on the one true Creator God, that they had some very serious misunderstandings about who God was and how He operated, based likely in part on their cross-contamination with the cultures of their region and the kind of beliefs that they had about their gods. And so that led them to pollute their view of God until it was very negative indeed. And we believe in this group that the same thing has happened over the intervening years from when the apostles first began spreading the gospel, which means good news, the good news about the character of God. As they began to spread this, that over the years that people who lusted after control got involved and began to change the message and to change the picture of God that was presented to people until it became largely unrecognizable to the apostles who had walked and ate and touched Jesus. We say touched because that's a point that John makes in his writings, that our hands handled him, we touched him, we know he was a real physical being, a human, because we touched him, we know this. So most of the Bible can be verified through secular history and has been determined to be a surprisingly accurate record of the history of the world, the portion of the history of the world that it covers. That when it says such and such happened, it's pretty likely that that's what happened. But when we get into the book of Genesis, that's when things get not so certain. The book of Genesis has just 12 chapters to cover 2,500 years or more, depending on how you think that played out, of the history of the world. That's a lot of history to cover in just 12 chapters. And obviously, you are going to miss a lot. Furthermore, we generally understand that none of this was written down until 2,500 years later. And I believe, anyway, I think there's evidence for this, that Moses made the Hebrew language a written language with all the time he had out in the wilderness watching his father-in-law's sheep, that he was highly educated because of his time in the courts of Egypt, and in the halls of power in Egypt, where he was, privileged and educated and so forth. So he would have learned about written language, and so I think Moses himself invented the Hebrew alphabet and writing for the Hebrew language, and then used that again during this time that he was watching Jethro's sheep, or the priest of Midian's sheep. We call him Jethro because it's a Jethro, but I won't get into it right now. We'll have time when we get to the book of Exodus and read through that and so forth. But so at that time, 2,500 years or even more had passed since the events listed at the beginning of this book. And 1,000 of those, roughly, since the events described in chapters 6 through 9, or the Great Flood. And the Great Flood itself is, of course, controversial because the agnostics and critics and atheists want to say that, well, that was just a localized event. It wasn't worldwide. There's evidence to suggest that, in fact, there was a worldwide flood, and I'm about to get into why people might want to deny that. So, at that point, you have just 8 people to carry all the information of the previous 1,500 years across that gap into a new world of people. And up until the day of Moses, there wasn't a lot of written language to carry this information on. So it was passed on orally, often poetically, because poetry is a contrivance of the human race that helps us to remember things. It's easier to recall exact wording if you've got poetry and the rhythm and pattern of language to help you. Oh, wait a minute, that can't be it because it doesn't fit the pattern. So it must be this way. So, yeah, that things should be poetic from time to time. Makes perfect sense if you're passing stuff from one person to the next by mouth, through verbal language. But that doesn't change the fact that in each generation, the account loses a level of accuracy, a level of detail, and things get changed based on the life experience of the people carrying the story on from one generation to the next. And so you have a situation, well, probably all of you have played gossip or telephone at some time, where somebody starts a saying and reads it in at one end, and people pass it on from one person to the next without letting anybody else hear what they're saying, and then you get it out at the other end and see how it's changed. Of course, when you play that, there are people who will um, intentionally foul that up because they think it's funny. Um, but even so, the point is, and the other point we could make is that human memory is malleable. You know, if a highly self-oriented person gets involved in a situation, when they go to talk about that situation later, they're going to recall it in a light that favors them. That's just human nature. So you get somebody into a courtroom and they've been accused of doing such and so, and they're like, "It wasn't that way at all. I need to tell you what really happened." Well, what's going on? Are they really telling you what really happened, or are they telling you their version and their recollections, which have been changed? They're malleable, changed in their mind to fit what their brain wants them to believe. Their need to feel that they're good and right and an upstanding person and more valuable than the people around them. So to admit to doing something inappropriate, you can't do that. So their brains then change their memories of the things, and you end up hearing very different accounts of things that happened, not because the people are necessarily intentionally lying, but because human memory is malleable and tends to change itself. And if you want some personal experience in that, take time to go back to places that you haven't seen since you were a kid and look at the difference between what you remembered and what's actually there. I was just gaining some experience in that on Google Earth. I was working on writing my dad's life story, and his family originated in the vicinity of Edmore and Cedar Lake, Michigan. So I was looking at that, and of course, Great Lakes Adventist Academy, once known as Cedar Lake Academy, is located just south of the intersection that's called Cedar Lake and where the post office is. And there was a grocery store there years ago, and I can remember riding with distant cousins over to that store and watching the store employees put the day's deals in the window with those big markers that they used to paint on window back in those days, and thinking that was a huge store. Well, it's not huge. It's really a tiny little building. Of course, it's been rebuilt, and the big windows are gone, and smaller windows are put in their place, and so forth. But I just wasn't that big. But that's what I remembered. Of course, when you're a little kid, everything seems bigger than it does. But even so, and you'll remember. Well, this was here and this was here, and then when I look it up, well, actually, things were a little bit different. Well, how did my memory get messed up? Well, that's just the nature of human memory. It's malleable. It tends to change over time. So for that reason, we have cause to say that people's memories of something that happened 2,500 or more years ago, while fundamentally telling us what happened, may have some gaps and some inaccuracies. Now, the other reason that the book of Genesis is so controversial is because of the whole creation versus evolution debate. And I'd like to talk a little bit about that too. The theory of evolution does not have a single origin, as a lot of people think. It wasn't just one man's idea. However, one man, one Charles Darwin, did some studies aboard a ship out in the Galapagos Islands, and he came up with some theories and ideas that allowed science to say, wait a minute, we don't need a God to have created life. Life can control and take care of itself, and new species can develop over time through the processes that Charles Darwin spelled out. Of course, in their day, with their understanding of genetics, that took millions and millions of years to take place. Nowadays, we know that some of the changes that Darwin observed could take place over just a few generations on the basis of something known as epigenetics. In other words, the genes don't have to change themselves, just the way the genes are expressed. And the mechanics of epigenetics are much more responsive to environment than genetics per se. And that actually suggests a creator who made life to be adaptable to a changing environment. But moving on, as that began to take place, then thinking people who looked at the unthinkably obnoxious God that was being promoted by religion in the day, and to some extent also today, said we cannot accept that such a God would have control over us just because he made us. Oh, look, he didn't make us. We can posit that God didn't make us, that we just happened by chance over millions, even billions of years. So now we don't owe anything to a creator. We're free. And of course, now you've got two different sides on the debate, because you've got the people who are the control addicts trying to hold people to a literal interpretation of the Bible word for word, the old word for word inspiration idea. And you've got these other people who are looking at the freedom of being out from under a demanding creator, and their debates can get emotional and very nasty, and so on and so on. Both of them very often fighting to get control. And the book of Genesis tells us the story of a terraforming event that took place over 7 24-hour days. And there are people who get very focused on that element of it. And I'm not going to tell you the world wasn't terraformed for humanity over those 7 literal days. I believe God does have the power to create like that, and there's evidence to believe that he may well have. But to demand that everybody else believe it that way because I believe it that way, I think is going a little bit too far. So we'll be reading about that. Then, of course, there's the story of the flood, because the people who believe in, and when I say believe in, I mean they hold to the theory of evolution as a way to escape a demanding God. Those people have found a lot of evidence that they think supports their view of life evolving over millions of years from simple forms to more complex forms. People who want to believe the Genesis account of creation say that the Genesis account of the flood can help to explain the evidence that everybody points to say, well, see, here's proof that it happened this way. Well, no, that's just proof it happened this way. Then they just get into more argument and nobody can agree about anything. Like I say, I think there's evidence that the flood of the Bible was a worldwide catastrophe. When we get to that part of Genesis, we can talk about that a little more. There are theories, and they're just theories. I mean, we have very, very, very little evidence to suggest that these things are true, but there are theories that hold that the flood was an event caused by human meddling. Like I say, that's just theories. We'll, like I say, again, talk about that when we get to that part of the book of Genesis. So as we read these first chapters, the account of creation, and then the account of the fall, we are going to take the position that we can't be absolutely certain about everything, and that some of what was written may be a reflection of the culture of the time it was written, not of the time the events happened. But we'll see that as we get there. And we mentioned this to a certain extent in our sermon presentation last week. Before I go on, what does it mean to believe in evolution? Well, evolution relies upon death and birth and competition for resources, and ultimately this concept that's frequently known as the survival of the fittest. Those most fit to survive in the present environment survive and pass on their genes to the next generation. Those who are less fit die or are killed by predators and do not pass their genes on to the next generation. Hence the Darwin Awards. People who remove themselves from the gene pool, often by dying, by doing something stupid like running from the cops. There was a recent incident, somebody was running from the cops. He went through an intersection, went through a red light at high speed, and a box truck happened to be in his way. And he, in a sense, earned himself a Darwin Award because he did not survive to tell the story. But that's the concept. And when people believe that strength and survival are the be-all and end-all of life, and these things are how the world will advance, then they believe in evolution, even if they say they are creationists and that they believe the 724-hour period account given at the beginning of the book of Genesis. Now, there's another issue regarding the book of Genesis. I'm aware of it. I have some knowledge of it, but not a lot. So I can't tell you which is which. But very early in the book of Genesis, we read two voices. There are two accounts of creation, and they're very different in their language and style and in their focus. There are two accounts of some of the other events involved, including to some extent two accounts of the flood. Now, if you look at the story of the life of Moses, who we are told wrote the book of Genesis, then this two account thing starts to make sense. For the first few years of his life, 3 or more, we're not sure, it was until he was weaned, so some people think it was about 3. Other people say it was until he was about 12. Moses lived with his Hebrew mother. And yeah, when we get to there, we can talk about who knew what about what was going on, but he was with his Hebrew mother. So he would have received at least some instruction and probably was able to recall some of the instruction of his mother. Then, of course, he was delivered up to the princess of Egypt and grew up as a prince himself of Egypt. And if we're to believe some of the other accounts, noted military strategist in Egypt. But then, when he was approximately 40 years old, he got a little hot-headed and did some things that he began to regret, and because of a threat to his life, he had to leave Egypt. He went off to the land of Midian, and there he came across the priest of Midian, who became his father-in-law. And there's the story of the incident at the well, which kind of reflects a previous incident told in the book of Genesis that we'll get into when we get there. And so he became a member of the household of this priest of Midian. So then he would have learned a lot from this person and received a different view of the account of the world up until that time. Now, once we get past the story of Abraham, then there's only one account, because that would only have come from Moses' mother. Midian was, I don't remember right now. He's either one of the sons of Ishmael. I think the Midianites were Ishmaelite, or he was one of the other sons of Abraham after Isaac was born and after Sarah died, and he remarried one Keturah. Those sons were all sent away so that Isaac would receive most of Abram's estate and the land and so forth. So the idea that there would be two accounts to beginning the book of Genesis shouldn't be surprising at all. That's the source material that Moses had available to him as he began to write these things down. So the first account continues through chapter 1 and into chapter 2. Somewhere in chapter 2, near the beginning of it, we'll see it switch to another account. Now, we only have one account of the fall. And, we'll talk about that when we get there. So, let's go up here and make a couple of changes. And here is the book of Genesis up in the New Living Translation. And again, we do this just because we think it's kind of an interesting translation. Sometimes words things uniquely. We find it to be pretty highly interpretive, and sometimes we disagree with it. But it's interesting to go through. And we do reference other translations from time to time. I have 3 over here to my left, 1 or 2 off to my right. So, as we go through these things, if questions occur, we'll sometimes look at those as well. And when it comes to the very first verse, very few versions vary the wording at all. So the wording of this version is exactly the same. Let me double check. As the wording of the NIV. If I can get these pages to turn here. Yeah, and is exactly the same. Let me find this. As the wording of the New American Standard Bible, the wording of the King James, almost everybody renders that first verse with exactly the same words. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now, some people have pointed out that other languages aren't quite as hep on the definite article as we are in English, that we tend to overuse it, the being the definite article, a being the indefinite article, and that we English speakers tend to use that definite article very heavily, so things don't make sense to us if it isn't there. But that in fact maybe the didn't belong there, that maybe an indefinite article would apply. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And at any rate, what beginning are we talking about? Now, there's a footnote there. You've already noticed that probably. Footnote A. So if we get the cursor over here where we can scroll down, it offers us a couple of alternative renditions of this verse. In the beginning, when God created the heavens and the earth, or when God began to create the heavens and the earth. So, there is a beginning of sorts here. And the account tells us that God created the heavens and the earth. Well, what heavens does it mean? Because we know that in the Bible, heavens can refer to the firmament, the heavens can refer to the stars, or heaven could refer to the place wherever it is that God and the angels live. Someplace in a different part of the universe, no doubt. So, is it talking about all of that? And did all of that get created all in this one 7-day week? Or, as I believe, are we describing a terraforming event? Why do I say that? Well, the very next verse says, the earth was. Wait a minute, the earth was? I thought it hadn't been created yet. And that's why I say maybe we're reading about a terraforming event instead of a call this stuff into existence out of nothing, which probably at some point God did. But the evidence, as we're about to read here in this second verse, and some of you are probably familiar with what we say about this, suggests that there was something here. It was formless and empty, but it was. And darkness covered the deep waters. And the Spirit of God was hovering over the surface of the waters. Now, the Hebrew for this formless and empty is tohu vabohu. And we have pointed out in the past that there's a text in Isaiah which says very specifically that God did not create the earth, Hebrew tohu. Most versions render that in vain or without meaning. But so at some point God created the earth and he did not create it tohu. But now this account tells us that at the point in time that this description is beginning, when God comes to this earth to terraform it, to prepare it for life, it was tohu and or va bohu, tohu va bohu or wa bohu, depending on who's doing the transliterating, and it's rendered formless and empty. But tohu can indicate a state of disarray, of confusion. Ooh, where have we heard that word confusion before? We just finished the book of Revelation, which describes something called Babylon. Babel, confusion. So, the earth was in a state of confusion, and darkness covered the deep waters. Should we maybe take this symbolically? Darkness representing lies? Now, what's even more interesting then is the next part of verse 2, where it says, "And the Spirit of God was hovering over the surface of the waters." Hovering may be a rather lame translation. There's a Hebrew word involved here that doesn't get used very often, and I didn't do the research on this for tonight's presentation, so it's a little rusty, but we did go through that at one point, and we discovered that this word gets used when the Spirit is dealing with beings that are contrary and are opposing what the Spirit is doing. So hovering suggests a very passive involvement. The Spirit of God is here. He's hovering over the water. If you take that literally, he's just waiting for things to begin happening. But if we take the meaning that is suggested by other uses of that Hebrew word, this is not passive, it is active. The Spirit of God was contending over the surface of the waters, contending with the darkness that covered the deep waters. Verse 3, "Then God said, 'Let there be light.' And there was light." Now, given what we've just studied in Revelation, that too can be taken symbolically and can have a great deal of meaning. Because we've suggested that the darkness here represents lies, largely lies about the character of God, lies about his intentions, lies about his motivations. And this has led to deep darkness, figurative darkness, and has led the Spirit of God to be there to contend with these contrary forces that have believed and are perpetuating these lies. And how does God deal with that situation? Well, there is absolutely no violence portrayed here. Then God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. What did we say about Revelation? About the one called Faithful and True, the rider on the white horse? He had a sword with which to slay the nations. But where did the sword come from? It came from his mouth. And we suggested then that at that point, this rider on the white horse, who we say is Jesus, speaks the truth in a way that it can no longer be denied. And this is what causes such great distress and leads to the death of so many of the people of this world. So here we have a similar situation. A lot of lies, darkness covering this planet. The Spirit of God there to contend with these contrary forces. And God comes and he says, let there be light. Whoosh. There's light. These evil forces are banished. They can't stand the light. They have to leave because they want to believe their lies. And when God has spoken the truth in the way he did here, the lies can no longer abide. So these forces leave, and now God is free to begin his work on preparing this planet for life. And God saw that the light was good. We're going to run across that word good a number of times here. Did somebody just send me a text? No, that's not what I wanted. Goodness me. You go to punch something and you say, "Oh, here, while you're about to touch it, let's throw something up so you don't touch what you want to. You touch what we want you to." Okay, well that wasn't just now, so I don't know what that was about. Just the phone being goofy, I guess. Where were we? Oh yes, God saw that the light was good. Then he separated the light from the darkness. God called the light day and the darkness night. Now, one of the arguments that we make at this point is that God did not, quotes, create light at this point. The rest of the universe needed light. We expect that many of the beings God created use light like we use it to determine the nature of our surroundings and to see what's going on. You can't see in the dark because seeing is based on light receptors that our bodies have developed or that God has created for us, but that our bodies that form along with our bodies when we are brought to being. And these light detectors are able to focus the light reflecting from various surfaces onto a surface in our eyes that allows us to then interpret that and get a mental grasp of what's in the environment around us by watching that. And of course, if you're watching me right now, then you're using a human device that mimics that by manipulating light, changing its color, changing the amount of light being displayed on the surface of a device that can then show you an image of what the camera in my computer can, quotes, see. So now you see my mouth moving. You hear my words through another electronic manipulation of things. And so light is involved, but the image you're seeing isn't the light reflecting off me, but it is based on the light reflecting from me as detected by a device in my computer. So that something so fundamental to the universe should be created at this point, we're suggesting that that may not be what this is intended to communicate. The thing that makes people think that is because of this line about him separating the light from the darkness, which again, that could be figurative. God saying, we're going to separate things. We're going to make a clear distinction between truth and lies. But then he calls the light day and the darkness night. Well, we think of a 24-hour period. And evening passed and morning came, marking the first day. Then God said, "Let there be a space between the waters, to separate the waters of the heavens from the waters of the earth." And that is what happened. God made this space to separate the waters of the earth from the waters of the heavens. God called the space sky. Let me read that in my more literal version here, the New American Standard. Then God said, "Let there be an expanse in the midst of the waters, and let it separate the waters from the waters." And God made the expanse and separated the waters which were below the expanse from the waters which were above the expanse, and it was so. And God called the expanse heaven. And there was evening and there was morning, a second day. That was the reading in that version. Just for the fun of it, let's read that in the NIV. And God said, "Let there be an expanse between the waters to separate water from water." So God made the expanse and separated the water under the expanse from the water above it. And it was so. God called the expanse sky, and there was evening and there was morning the second day. Now that leads to some of the interesting theories. Now, in our day and age, we say, well, that's separating the liquid waters of the earth from the vaporous waters of the atmosphere. But wait a minute. Aren't we reading about the atmosphere itself here? Isn't God creating an atmosphere around the planet? That is a layer of gases, oxygen, nitrogen, carbon dioxide. All of these things necessary for the existence of life on the planet. Without an atmosphere, life, as God is designing it to be on this planet, couldn't be possible. So the sequence here makes sense, because he's going to make plants on the third day, but before he can make plants, the plants have to have an atmosphere. They have to have a gaseous environment, or they cannot survive. So God prepares that. But the idea of this waters above being the vaporous waters of our atmosphere, our atmosphere can do a very poor job of separating the waters, because those vaporous waters can come right down to earth, and there'll be no gap between the waters below and the waters above. If you've seen a fog on a lake, there's no separation there. And this says that God made a space to separate the waters from the waters. And of course, this version gets interpretive and says the waters of the earth from the waters of the heavens. What are the waters of the heavens? And this leads to one of the theories that we will refer to. We're not saying that this is necessarily true. It's just an interesting theory. But it would explain a lot of things. And that is the idea that God actually placed water, H2O, above the earth as well as on the earth. Now, the waters apparently were already there, because in verse 2 we read that darkness covered the deep waters. And that also suggests perhaps that the planet was completely covered in water, and that the process of separating those waters, there was something to separate them made on the second day, but the actual separation takes place on the third day. We're about to read that. So that there was actually H2O in some form above the atmosphere containing the atmosphere. Now, what would that do? And given what we know about space now, it's likely that said water would be frozen, would be ice. But it would spread out and modify this thing that earth scientists call insolation. Insolation, which is incoming solar radiation. We know that on the planet we live in, that is rather unevenly divided. So there are temperate zones, there are tropical zones, and there are Arctic zones on this planet. The Arctic zones don't get enough sun and light. The tropical zones get too much heat and light. The temperate zones tend to vary because of the wobble of the Earth's rotation, so that part of the year we get a lot of light and warmth from the sun, and part of the year we don't get much. And in the northern hemisphere, we're right now in the part of the year where we don't get a whole lot, and the day is very short. So if we had that blanket of ice holding the atmosphere in, that would tend to even things out. The other thing it would do is that some of the forms of radiation that the sun pours out all the time, various particle rays, would get blocked by the water. And so the planet would be safer from that form of potentially damaging solar radiation by some form of protection of water above the atmosphere. And the language here is really quite specific. That this atmosphere, this expanse, was created to separate the waters. So there were waters above, there were waters below. And evening passed and morning came, marking the second day. Then God said, "Let the waters beneath the sky flow together into one place, so dry ground may appear." And that is what happened. God called the dry ground land and the waters seas. Well, we're going to discuss the potential that the seas were not nearly as extensive at that point as they were now. And, Moses, as he's writing this down, may not have been prepared to understand that. He was familiar with the earth as it existed in his day, with land and seas, and with somewhere between 2/3 and 3/4 of the earth's surface covered by water. But if, in fact, a large amount of water was removed and separated out and put above the atmosphere, then the seas on the earth would have been much less extensive, and the land masses would have been much larger and more conjoined and so forth. And God saw that it was good. Now it's interesting, he didn't say that on the second day. He said that on the first day. He said the light was good. And now the dry ground appears, and God sees that it is good. Then God said, "Let the land sprout with vegetation, every sort of seed-bearing plant, and trees that grow seed-bearing fruit. These seeds will then produce the kinds of plants and trees from which they came." And that is what happened. The land produced vegetation, all sorts of seed-bearing plants and trees with seed-bearing fruit. Their seeds produced plants and trees of the same kind, and God saw that it was good. God didn't say anything good about the second day, but now on the third day he says it twice to make up for it, I suppose. So then we have dry land appearing, and we have vegetation appearing on the earth. Now, when people say that these things grow in an order that makes sense, we kind of wonder about that, because one of the things that plants need is sunshine, because they produce their food through a process we call photosynthesis. Their leaves receive the light of the sun and use that energy to form the various compounds that they need to build themselves up and to grow. So if that were strictly true, then day 4 needed to precede day 3 so there'd be a sun to provide energy for the plants. But if it's only a 24-hour period, then, one day, yeah, they can probably, God made them happen, and next day provided the light they needed, and it's not a big deal. But just pointing out that some people's theories about this don't hold as much water as they think they do. So, again, on the third day, twice, God says or saw that things were good. Then we get to the fourth day. Then God said that lights appear in the sky to separate the day from the night. I thought he'd already separated the day from the night. And he goes on, "Let them be signs to mark the seasons, days, and years. Let these lights in the sky shine down on the earth." And that is what happened. God made 2 great lights, the larger one to govern the day, the smaller one to govern the night. He also made the stars. God set these lights in the sky to light the earth, to govern the day and night, and to separate the light from the darkness. And God saw that it was good. And evening passed, and morning came, marking the 4th day. Now, we understand in our day, and Moses may have understood this, although there appears to have been a period in Earth's history when people didn't understand this, at least certain people didn't have an idea that certain fundamental truths have been known by some people all throughout the history of the earth. It's just that the people in charge of history didn't like those truths and wanted other things to be true, and kept those ideas hidden and suppressed. So we think of those ages as ages of darkness, which they were, because the powers that controlled things wanted things to be dark, but that there were people likely all through the history of the earth that understood certain fundamental things that were lost to the authorities who didn't want them to be true. And one of them was the idea that the earth is not the center of the universe. If the earth were the center of the universe, then everything around the earth, no matter how far away it was around the earth, would be rotating across us at the same rate every day, every night, every day, every night. That would have the things way far out, moving at incredibly high speed. Of course, those people they weren't good thinkers. They wouldn't have been so controlling if they had been. So they probably didn't think about that. They may not have been aware of how far away some of those things were. But even for the earth to move that fast in its distance from the sun would be ridiculously fast. What looks like everything moving around the Earth is actually a case of the Earth spinning. And that makes it look to us who are stuck on the Earth and who don't detect that motion because we're moving with it. So we have our own frame of reference. And in physics, you understand that everything can happen in a frame of reference. And everything in that frame of reference will be true as if it were stationary, even though it is not. So we don't perceive our motion, but through observations and intelligent processing of the data we can gather, we are able to determine that yes, the Earth goes round and round, and that's what makes it look like everything in the world, everything in the universe centers around the world. But in fact, the Earth rotates or orbits around a center, and that orbit defines the year. We rotate around the Earth once a year, and we have defined the year so carefully nowadays that it is 365 and a quarter, but not quite a quarter days to make that trip. And so we have the leap year system, and it's all very convoluted and complicated. And if you remember the whole thing, you're more into it than I am. I know that there's a leap year every 4 years, unless the year ends in 2 zeros, and other rules like it. It's apparently pretty reliable, but it's also kind of complex because you're dealing with a number that is it's a real number, but it's not a rational number. And when we say rational, we don't mean rational as insane. We mean rational as can be expressed as a ratio of two whole numbers. For example, the number pi, that's not rational. You cannot express pi as a ratio of two whole numbers. Can't be done. It's an irrational number. It has no repeating digits. In fact, I can remember subbing for math teachers in high school and reaching the lesson where the students were taught the proof and were actually given exercises to execute the proof that a repeating decimal is in fact a rational number. There is a math manipulation you can do to prove that any number with a repeating decimal can be represented as a ratio of two whole numbers. And that's what we call a rational number. So the number of days in a year is not a rational number. It's very complex. But, moving on then. So, we understand the greater light to represent the sun, the lesser light to represent the moon. They're very different in nature, however, because while the Earth orbits the sun, the Earth doesn't orbit the moon orbits the Earth. And in fact, some nights, the position of the moon is such that it's essentially not up all night long. And other times, when there's a full moon, the position of the moon is such that it's up all night long. So that probably an oversimplification in the language here suggests that the larger one governs the day and the smaller one governs the night. Yeah, you normally see the moon at night. You can see the moon in the daytime. It's a little harder because of how bright the sun is, but so the moon is generally associated with the night. But and that gets to another part of a theory that I will briefly reference here, but get into more later, and that is the idea that in fact God created the earth with two moons and had the moons at a particular angle to each other to even out so that there wouldn't be tides. And if you look at a water molecule, that's oxygen, an oxygen atom, being orbited by two hydrogen atoms, and they aren't opposite each other. They're at an angle. That's what makes water polar. And that suggests the stability of that kind of a system, and that would have been used to help maintain the water blanket around the Earth, which protected it from the harshest elements of solar radiation. However, moving on, verse 20, then God said, let the waters swarm with fish and other life. Let the skies be filled with birds of every kind. So God created great sea creatures and every living thing that scurries and swarms in the water, and every sort of bird, each producing offspring of the same kind. And God saw that it was good. Then God blessed them, saying, be fruitful and multiply. Let the fish fill the seas, and let the birds multiply on the earth. And evening passed, and morning came, marking the fifth day. Now, some people like to make a big deal about this concept of evening and morning, and pointing out that in the Hebrew system, the day began at sunset. And then you had the night or the evening, and then you had the morning, the daylight part. So the day starts with the night and ends with the day. In our Roman system, we've tried to divide the night roughly in half and set a point in the middle of the night that the day changes. And that may largely be because of our commerce-focused system of living. We need the date to change at a point when it is going to be least disruptive of our human activities. So we make it at that midpoint of the night when the date actually changes. In biblical reckoning, we will likely come across places where the significance of the day beginning at sundown shows up. And we've, years ago, 2 or 3 years ago, when we covered the Gospels in the New Testament, we talked about the possibility that the, quotes, Last Supper, which generally people believe happened on Thursday night, if it took place after midnight, was the Passover meal. And it wasn't a case of the disciples celebrating Passover on one day and the Pharisees celebrating Passover on another day. They were all celebrating it on the same day. It began after sundown. After sundown, it was now Passover day, and the disciples went and prepared the meal, and Jesus joined them, and they had the Passover meal in the upper room at that time. Anyway, so then we get to verse 24, and God said, and I haven't really commented on that yet, but notice over and over, then God said. God said, let there be light. God said, let there be an expanse. God said, let the dry land appear, let vegetation. God said, God said. Until we read in Psalms that God created by the word of the Lord. He said it, it happened. And I've even heard somebody once, and I think this person is the person whose daughter I occasionally encounter on Facebook. He said that speech is a form of energy, and nowadays we have limited means of converting matter back into energy. we call that nuclear energy. And we take very, very small amounts of matter, a few electrons and neutrons and protons from a single atom. We blow that atom apart and it produces two smaller atoms. I mean the molecule. No, the atoms, yeah. We blow those atoms apart, create two smaller atoms, and some of the matter in the original atom does not become matter in one of the two resulting atoms. And that little bit of matter, that stray neutron, proton, electron, those small bits of matter get converted directly into energy. And if you have ever seen or heard described the explosion of a nuclear weapon, the vast amounts of energy involved in what is just a few grams or less of matter. The bombs dropped on Japan were not that big. And a lot of the mass of the bomb was the devices to detonate it at the appropriate time, so that the actual fissionable material was relatively small, and only a small fraction of that matter became energy, but the amount of energy that was then released was just absolutely astounding from the human frame of reference. So this man suggested, if God creates by speaking, what he's doing is he's turning energy into matter. Imagine the colossal amounts of energy required to produce the matter of an entire planet. Something to think about. What it means when we say God is all powerful. If he can call things into being by speaking them, if he is indeed turning energy directly into matter, what amazingly astounding amounts of energy must be involved. So we were reading verse 24. I don't remember how far I got, so let's start over there. And then God said, "Let the earth produce every sort of animal, each producing offspring of the same kind. Livestock, small animals that scurry along the ground, and wild animals." And that is what happened. God made all sorts of wild animals, livestock, and small animals, each able to produce offspring of the same kind. And God saw that it was good. Then God said, "Let us make human beings," or that footnote, we've already looked at that, at least I did while we were down there. Man, the Hebrew reads Adam. Adam is the Hebrew for man or for human. All right. In our image, to be like us. They will reign over the fish in the sea, the birds in the sky, the livestock, all the wild animals on the earth, and the small animals that scurry along the ground. Then we break into poetry. So God created human beings in his own image. In the image of God he created them. Male and female he created them. We've already passed up two other footnotes, C and D. C says, as in the Syriac version, the Hebrew reads all the earth. Um, that would be the wild animals on the earth, okay. And then, yeah, Ha-Adam, the man. But then it says plural there. God created the man. The Hebrew reads Ha-Adam. All right. But there's a fascinating principle being suggested in this verse. So God creates the human species, the one we call Homo sapiens, in his own image, after his likeness. We were designed to reflect the character of God. And then the poem puts it in 2 lines. In the image of God he created them, plural pronoun, male and female he created them. Those lines are parallel. Blank he created them, blank he created them. First it says in the image of God he created them, and then it says male and female he created them. The image of God is so full of meaning that it was not possible for a single human to fully represent the character of God. And so God created 2 humans, male and female, and in order to fully represent the image of God, both male and female would be required. Now, we have in this group had some reservations about people who are homophobic. We do not advocate homosexual marriage, however. And one of the reasons for doing that is this. If you don't have both male and female in the union, you get a lopsided picture of God. The image of God is not fully realized unless you have both male and female. That's the parallelism of this verse 27. I mean, in both cases, he created them. And in the first, it's the image of God. And in the second, it's male and female. Male and female are part and parcel of the image of God. And the image of God cannot be fully represented without both male and female. Now, one of the points we're making there is that when religious organizations decides that only males should stand in the place of representing God, then that organization has blocked out half of the image of God because it's not allowing the females to also be there to represent the image of God. And their faith, their understanding of God is diminished and lessened as a result. Then God blessed them and said, this isn't the first time he said this, by the way, be fruitful and multiply, or increase in number. I think that's how the NIV puts it. Yes. I'm not looking at the right section. Yeah. Multiply, increase in number. We'll discuss that maybe a little later on. Fill the earth and govern it. Reign over the fish of the sea, the birds in the sky, and all the animals that scurry along the ground. Then God said, look, I have given you every seed-bearing plant throughout the earth, and all the fruit trees for your food. And I have given every green plant as food for all the wild animals, the birds in the sky, and the small animals that scurry along the ground, everything that has life. And that is what happened. Then God looked over all he had made, and he saw that it was very good. And evening passed, and morning came, marking the sixth day. So, God has prepared this planet for life, and then in the last 2 days of the sixth, he has created the life that then populates the planet. Is this merely a symbolic representation? Well, I'll leave that for you to decide. I personally tend to hold to a creation week of essentially 6 24-hour periods, followed by the seventh, which we're going to read about in the next chapter. It's still part of this first account of creation, by the way. But I'm not going to tell you that you're crazy and nuts if you want to believe something else about it. We have read what it says. We have noted that this was put down in writing many hundreds of years after the events took place. How many, I don't think we're going to try to determine, because, with an account that's old, there's probably things that have been left out. There was a time when religion insisted that the earth was 6,000 years old, so that the creation happened right about 4,000 BC. Well, then they began to fudge that, but that's all based on what genealogies we have available to us out of Genesis. And while some of the numbers and so forth in there may have some level of accuracy, there might be things that are missing, and we can't add them in, so we can't tell for sure. But our time's already up. We've been going for longer than I intended, so I guess I need to call this off. My wife's still asleep, and she can call in. That's okay. Life goes on, and we plan to see you again, do this again next week, at the same time, 6:30 Central if you want to join live. Of course, if you don't care to join live, you can always view the recorded edition later. Well, I think a lot of people do that, so that it fits into their schedule, and that's cool. So we thank you for joining us. We invite you to join us next week, and until then we say goodbye and God bless.